Last week we started in on a new series on how to get better without being discouraged. And today we're going to give you a few things to help you stay on that road toward whatever it is that God's called you to do. All right, let's jump into it. Well, welcome back everybody. My name is Stephen Reed. I'm part of the team here at Music and Ministry, and today we're going to continue our series on how to get better without being discouraged. And last week we talked a little bit about how do we not get stuck on either side of the road to our destination, our calling really, being stuck in the ditch of discouragement where we think that we're terrible and we're never going to get better and we want to give up, and also not being getting stuck in the ditch of pride where we just kind of surround ourselves with people that tell us what we want to hear. We refuse to look at things because we don't want to see our problems, and so that we end up getting stuck just because we feel like we've already arrived. Or we're a little bit nervous about what it's going to take to get to whatever it is that God's called us to go to, or that, perhaps that maybe we aren't good enough to make it. I definitely feel all those feelings, understand those feelings. I feel some of those feelings now, but what I've learned, what I feel like the Lord's shown me, some things that I want to share with you today will help you get further down the road. And I know for me, these were some revelations that made a huge impact just in the nature of the ministry that I was doing and then just in my life in general. And so as we start talking about, okay, how do we actually evaluate? And that means that we're taking a look at how things are going. We're not hiding ourselves from it, but we're actually taking an honest look. And that is really a key there, is an honest look, because we tend to be very emotional as creatives or just musicians in general. And we can kind of, as we were talking about last time, we can end up in one ditch where we think, oh, I'm so amazing and I'm going to get a record contract, to then, oh, I'm terrible and I should just quit and this is never going to be. And so we end up going back and forth. And a lot of people, especially in leadership, can't handle those mood swings, and we have to figure out how to handle those things as well, because sometimes we can just get a little overboard on some of those things. So an honest look, meaning that we're really, not making ourselves more than we think we should be, but we're also not discounting ourselves. There's an honest medium in there that we can actually then use those things to move forward to what we're doing. So I would say honesty is definitely an important key in that. Number two is going to be keeping the main thing, because sometimes in our evaluation, we can just get down in the weeds or the nitty gritty of something, and then we kind of end up veering off into something else just because, well, this could be better. But we have to constantly ask ourselves, is that the thing that we're supposed to be doing? Is that going to take us to the main thing? Is the main thing the main thing? How are we achieving that? We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. And then the third point that I want to make today, hopefully we'll have enough time, is that we then have to gain the perspective of others, because sometimes we can get in our own group and we kind of reassure ourselves. And I know I made this mistake probably multiple times, where we all, at the end of our evaluation, we're like, yeah, we're doing a great job, only to find out we all thought that we were doing it, but we hadn't gained the outside perspective that we needed. So let's jump into that and talking about, okay, how do we actually do an evaluation? And some of this is going to be covered in a book that I wrote called How I Learned to Delegate. And it's not a very big book, but it was a big deal to actually get one made. And I talk a little bit about creating a culture of evaluation, and then also just some of the other aspects I did. So I'm going to cover some of the things that are in this book and some things that are not in this book. So maybe I need to revise it as we go forward. So that all being said, when we actually started the process of evaluating, I was really nervous about it because I didn't want it to be negative and I didn't want it to create problems. So then we just had to kind of figure out, okay, how are we going to do this in a way that's upbeat, that's honest, that keeps the main point. For us in youth group, we would just, after every meeting, we would break out the whiteboard. We had a little meeting, a leader meeting, and we would just take 10 minutes and we would quickly answer these 3 questions. And I covered them a little bit last week, but let's go over them just real quick. And the question is, what went well? All right. And then the next question was, what didn't go as well as we were hoping to? Not what went wrong, but what didn't go as well as we were hoping to, because we wanted to stay positive. And then the third one was, what are we going to do about it next time? So eventually we got to the place where it didn't take very long to evaluate. We had created a culture of evaluation. And so we could just, in 10 minutes, we could answer those questions. People were willing to share. People were honest. Nobody got offended. And it was pretty amazing. Now, I say it got to that point because it did not start at that point. Because anytime that you open things up for evaluation, you're going to get really one of 2 responses. The one is going to be somebody being uber negative and just spouting out all their complaints and things that they wanted to say but didn't get a chance. And then that often causes contention. But we didn't have that. We actually had the other one, which I think is a little more common, which is complete silence. When I should be like, so what went well tonight? And, there was like maybe a few people would say something, but then nobody would say anything when it came time to be like, what didn't go as well as we were hoping? And it was just like everybody had thoughts of what they didn't like or what they didn't think went well, but they were unwilling to share those things. And so it's a big deal to create the culture where that's going to be okay for them to say something that maybe isn't going to be 100% positive. So I found that I had to be the one that broke the ice. And I've had to do this in other situations and circumstances when I've done these evaluations with different worship teams. I did it with a conference team that I was a part of, certainly in our group as a family and a ministry, we do these things. And so you have to, as the leader, be willing to say something like, man, I really thought my part of this stunk. Like that I really kind of like, say I was preaching or say I was leading worship or something, I would say, man, I really feel like I didn't choose the best songs tonight. And it might be, and it probably is what everybody else is thinking, but because it was self-critical, I wasn't casting blame on anybody else. Everybody would either be able to laugh and say, yeah, I was kind of had that thought as well. And so they're not the one that's accusing, they're just agreeing. Or if they didn't agree with that, they would be like, no, I really thought the songs were great. And then I'd be like, well, I didn't feel like it went really well right here. Does anybody have any ideas of why that would possibly be? And then that just kind of opened up this like, oh, okay, this isn't us getting in trouble or blaming each other. We're actually looking for critical thinking and not criticism. So it just created a safe space by kind of breaking through those barriers. And I think that's super important to do. And then just to make sure that we're always keeping it positive. And there's a phrase that I learned, and it's actually something that Apple computers do at their Mac stores. And so they have a policy where they're allowed to talk or to give critical feedback to any person on the team. So the person who just got hired that day, if they see something like, well, that didn't go so well, to like senior management, they're expected to say something, and there's a whole protocol, and you can go look it up. It's called fearless feedback. And one of the tenets of that is that you have to assume positive intent. So I'll say that again. You have to assume positive intent. That if somebody says, hey, that didn't go well, they're not mad at you. They're not being critical of you. They're just saying, hey, that didn't go well. So maybe they didn't say it correctly. Maybe it caught you off guard. But you have to just remember, I'm assuming positive intent, meaning that they only want to help our group, our worship team, our youth group, or whatever it is that you're doing your evaluation for. They only want to see it get better. They don't necessarily want to attack me personally. So I'm sure there are some points where that's not the case, but if we assume positive intent, then we're going to step over all of those places where we could potentially be offended. And then if they're, at some point it was like, no, this is really not positive intent, they're trying to be negative, then we can call that out and just be like, hey, let's keep this positive. So in being willing to be self-critical first, and then again, just trying to create this culture, then it breaks down the wall. People are willing to share more things. And so you kind of get to this place where you are finding what's wrong, but you're doing it in a way that's not critical of the person. So you're critical of the thing, sure. You're like, hey, that, the bass part was kind of out of step there. And so you're just like, okay, why do we think that is, not you're a bad bass player? It's just that didn't work out. So how do we fix that? How do we put you in an environment where you can hear better? Maybe we're just having a stylistic difference, like you're playing a different style than this style. And so we need to come together on what it is that we're trying to achieve. And so it's really more about, let's figure out what's wrong, not necessarily cast blame to tell you that you are wrong. And so that's really a big deal in order to create the culture where you're getting this feedback, this information that's going to help you, help everybody get down to where it is that we want to go. And so I would write all of those things down on the whiteboard. And part of that was I just wanted people to know that I was hearing what it is that they were saying, that I wasn't brushing it off. So even if I didn't agree, I would still write it down. If somebody said, hey, this went well, I'm like, oh man, do you think so? Like there was no initial pushback. I would just write down, hey, this went well. And then we would write down all the different things. And then we'd go to the next one, and then we'd write it down. Again, if I didn't agree with it, that wasn't the moment to say it. We would just write it down because we wanted to hear what people think. And part of it is we want that culture to go, but I want to hear what it is that you say, not because maybe I disagree with it, but it will certainly give me huge ideas and huge insight into how you're thinking and how you see things as part of my team. And so how can I help you grow if I don't even know what's going on inside of that brain, inside of your heart, inside of your emotions? It makes it very difficult to do that as a leader. Whereas if you are telling me things, then I can be like, oh, okay, I can help them grow in this area. I can help them see this. There's something that I can do to help them realize what it is why we have a difference of opinion. So then once we got those down, then we would go back and we would talk about some of them. And so we would say, like, how did we feel like that was wrong? You said this about that song, you didn't feel like it was good. Like, what did you mean by that? And so then you're kind of probing and you're like, man, I thought this part of the song went really well. Did you not feel like it? And they might be like, well, no, that part went well, but this other part. And so then we keep getting down, refining to, and then I can say like, oh, okay, I see that. Or, oh, that's interesting. I've never noticed it. I'll have to look at it next time, right? And so there's this like affirming that you're doing. You're not lying. You're not saying, oh yeah, you were right. But you're also not just coming against people. But there is a way that you can then bring it up and say like, hey, let's talk about what it is you mean by that. So that way we're not like secretly being offended, but we're also, again, gathering what it is that we're trying to do so we can do something about it or make it better. So the third question is really where it kind of got from, hey, let's just talk about stuff to, okay, let's make changes. And it's like, well, what are we going to do different next time? And there were some times where we would get some things that we would evaluate and there was a very clear like, okay, yeah, let's not do that again. Let's try this, or this really worked really well for this thing. So let's do that, try and do that again next week and see if that pattern holds true. And so we would then make a plan based on those things. And there was also sometimes where there was like something on the list that didn't go well. And we were like, what are we going to do about it? And everybody's just like, I don't know. So in that, there's kind of a couple ways that you can look at that. Is number one is we don't know how to do anything different. And so we're kind of stuck. And so then you can go and look for something different to do. Or you kind of reveals that like, this isn't something that's really that important to us. And so that's fine, because at some point you're just looking for feedback, looking for information, whether or not it's small, whether or not it's significant. You're just looking for people to notice things. Yeah, we noticed that, but it's not a big deal. And if we used our effort to chase that thing, we're going to end up missing where it is that we're actually supposed to be going. And so that's where we were talking about earlier of like keeping the main thing the main thing. And so for worship leading, every church, every group has a different really vision for what it is that they're trying to accomplish. And so we sometimes make mistakes where we don't realize that those things are different at different places because it's not always as obvious as we would maybe like to think that it is. But I've been to a lot of churches where the main goal of the worship time was to prepare people for the message, or was to get people to attend the church. And you're like, okay, well, those are good things, but that's a very different goal than getting people to dive into the deep places of God. And so there were some places that I've been where they're like, we don't want to try and go into the deep places of God during our Sunday morning services. We want them to have energy. We want them to get focused and get ready for the message. And that's when you get off the stage. And you're like, whoa, wait a minute, what? And so again, like, you don't broadcast that information before you get up and lead worship. You're just doing what it is that you think that is important, and you're assuming that the other people are doing that as well. And that is a whole nother conversation for another video, talking about how do we understand what it is that is our vision. But sometimes if you don't know that, or if you're just like focusing on some detail of like, hey, this snare drum thing kind of got weird in this spot, if the whole point of what it is you're doing is to get people to enter into the presence of God, is that snare drum causing a problem, or is that just like a musical preference issue that's like way over here? And so sometimes we can chase musical excellence, and we're not the saying that being musically excellent couldn't be important, but that's not what we're doing. At least for myself and other people I know, that's not what we're trying to do. We're not trying to make a perfect band replication of some song. We're not a cover band. We're trying to lead people to worship. And so again, that's a whole range of what that might possibly mean to you. But sometimes we can get so stuck on our musical performance that we then can't or are not able to lead the people into the presence of God because we're too concerned about how it sounds. And so that's not to say that how it sounds is not unimportant, because if it sounds bad and it causes distraction, or people just don't like it so they're not going to come, well, that creates problems that we're not going to achieve. So there is a certain level at which we need to pay attention to that. But at some point, it can actually detract from what it is that we're trying to actually do, the main thing being the main thing, to the point where we get off to where something else is the main thing, and the main thing is getting left behind or is being diminished by our focus in this area. So that takes a lot of maturity and wisdom to know that, like, hey, that's really not as important, but you're constantly asking yourself, does this connect us to the vision? Is doing this different going to help us achieve the vision? And then at the end of that, you're evaluating, did that change make it better, or did it make it worse? And again, if you don't take the time to ask, then you're just going to end up following down roads that may or may not matter. But the other thing that means you have to know is, what is the vision? And you're constantly coming back to that and saying, are we achieving what it is that we're supposed to be achieving? All right, so at the end of the time that we would have our evaluation, I would then take a picture of my whiteboard, all my markings, and I would keep them in a folder, and I would go back and I would then look at them again before the next time that we got together, and we would then make sure that we had divided off who's going to do all those things. If I hadn't assigned those things, I would assign them again, and I would again keep a list of them, and then I would go back periodically and review those to see what the trends were, to see how it is that we were doing and what it is that we were noticing. And super important, especially for events that took a long time in between happening again, like camps and things like that we were doing for youth group, or if, say you're doing like Easter or your Christmas presentation, there's going to be a long time in between. And if you don't have notes of what went well, what didn't well, what you're going to do next time, by the time you get back up to it again, you're just going to forget all those things and potentially make the same mistakes again. And so we always called those love notes to ourselves, where we were just like basically sending them into the future to be like, hey, you should think about this next time. And so, so important as we got to where we just really enjoyed that process. Again, it didn't take very much time, but I would tell you this, the mistake that we made, and I didn't realize until much later, it was that we only got the opinion of the people that were in our group. And when I was a youth pastor, it was all of our youth leaders. We all got together and evaluated everything, but we never actually talked to any of our students. It was just the youth leaders. And so there were things that we were doing that the youth leaders loved that the kids did not like. And so we kept saying, no, this is great, this is great, this is great. And not realizing that the kids were like, no, we don't like this, we don't like this, we don't like this. And so I see it all the time in worship teams, and especially when we start talking about how do we reach the younger generations. And so I've worked with several worship teams and churches where we actually form a committee, form a group, a focus group, so to speak, of people that it is that they're trying to reach. So one church in particular was trying to reach Gen Z, and so I was like, are any of you guys Gen Z? And all of them are none. And I'm like, do you have any kids that are Gen Z? And the answer was none. And I was like, all right, well, we got to get some people that represent that group and get them in together, and we're all in together so we can ask questions, we can get their input, and we can find out what is it that they're thinking. What do they want? What do they need from us? What are they confused by? And so once we started doing that, there was a lot of light bulbs going off for the leadership, because they're like, oh, that's important to you, or oh, you see it that way, or the Gen Z people would say something, and I would stop the meeting and be like, all right, who of you who is not Gen Z understands what it is that they just said? And everybody like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so then both would be like, really? You don't know what I'm talking about? Like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so then you kind of realize maybe this is where we're missing the connection in between these things. And so I would encourage you, in whatever it is that you're doing, certainly have evaluations amongst your team, but there's got to be some way that you then find and have a lifeline, not just to everybody, because if you start asking, I would just never put out an ad in your bulletin or in the announcements like, hey, send us your feedback, because you're only going to get the people that complain that are going to say something. You want to go find feedback versus having that feedback just come to you. So people that complain, sometimes they're valid and they're bringing something that will be very good, and sometimes they're just people who are negative and like to complain. And those are not the people that we want to listen to. Those are not the people that we want steering the ship. We don't want to be led by the complainers. Biblically speaking, that's not a good thing. That's how the children of Israel ended up wandering in the desert, because they were listening to the complainers instead of listening to what God had for them to say. And so we just need to make sure that we're going and we're choosing who it is that we're listening to and getting their opinion. And so I would ask certain people rather than just receiving whatever kind of information that comes to you. All right, that is a lot of information, but these are the things that really help us know whether or not we're doing as good a job as we think we're doing. And again, if you receive them in a positive way, assuming positive intent, and then you take a look at them, it's like, how are we going to fix them? Not just how you got to do something different or I have to do something different. It's a collective issue. It can make it to where it's not so overwhelming. And then we can move forward and, okay, what is it that we're going to do about this to actually do what God's called us to do. Well, as always, you can find out more about what we do, and there's lots more resources over at musicandministry.co. We hope that you have a fantastic week this week, and as always, God bless.